Welcome to Chess Dog. I am John, and today we have a game from the Tata Steel Masters. Magnus Carlsen versus Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa. Pragg has the black pieces, Carlsen has the white pieces. And in this game, we really see something that separates Magnus Carlsen from all the other players in the world. It's a brilliant concept. Let's jump right in. Again, Pragg has white. Carlsen has black, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3. Carlsen takes on c4, the queen's gambit accepted, and the idea is to simplify the position, usually with a move like c5 to liquidate white's central space advantage. e3, so the bishop can now recapture the pawn at c4. a6, with the idea of b5 to defend the c4 pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Knight f6, castles, and c5, the thematic move. Pragg plays b3. This allows the bishop at c1 to go to b2 to defend this pawn or place itself on the long diagonal, or to a3 to put pressure on the c5 pawn. As it turns out, he ends up doing both. b6 is played, so Carlsen can play the bishop to b7 and defend the c5 pawn. Bishop to a3. The threat is to capture on c5 and leave black with a weak isolated pawn at c5. So Carlsen defends the pawn with the knight, so he can always recapture with a piece and not have a pawn weakness. So Pragg says, okay, I'm castled. Carlsen's king is in the middle of the board. Let's open up lines. Makes sense. He plays d5, trying to exchange in the center and get at black's king. Pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. And this bishop, as we see, attacks the rook. Now here it would be a mistake for Carlsen to take the bishop. It seems like a natural move, get rid of a powerful piece, grab the two-bishop advantage. But after queen takes, hitting the rook, and the rook has to move, then Pragg would play the bishop back to b2. And the bishop at b2 hits this g7 pawn and makes it very hard for Carlsen to develop this f8 bishop. Carlsen would be in some trouble here. What he does instead is just ignores the bishop for now and just moves the rook out of the way, which he has to do. Now when the bishop comes back, when Pragg plays this knight blocks the bishop's access to the g7 pawn. That allows Carlsen to go ahead and play bishop e7, and now we see he has a very nice, fluid development, and he's definitely equalized out of the opening. Knight to c3, castles, and queen to c2. So we can look at the middle game here and sort of assess the plans for each side. We have what's called mutual pawn majorities. White has a 4-pawn to 3 advantage on the king side. Carlsen has a 3 to 2 pawn advantage on the queen side. So what Carlsen is going to want to do is advance these pawns, try to create a passed pawn, and queen it. Pragg would kind of like to do the same. The problem is his king is behind his pawn, so to move any of these 4 pawns would simply weaken his king. So he wants to use these 2 bishops to generate an attack. b5, this is the game's novelty, but it makes all the sense in the world. Carlsen is simply advancing his pawn majority. Rook to d1, placing the rook opposite the queen. The queen moves out of the way, and Carlsen is threatening to grab the 2 bishops with knight to b6. And Pragg plays a4, which actually stops that because of this interesting variation. If Carlsen plays knight to b6 now, then knight takes b5, then pawn takes bishop to e5, skewering the queen and rook, and when the queen moves to a7, now pawn takes, and the a file is open. Very hard to see that idea that a4 stops knight to b6. But Carlsen did see it and did not play knight to b6. He played h6. The idea is to keep this knight out of g5, to deal with any potential sacrificial or mating ideas that would lead to a queen going to h7 with mate with a knight placed on g5. So h6 keeps a minor piece, particularly the knight, out of the g5 square. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Queen to e2, threatening to take on b5, so Carlsen defends with queen to b6. e4, gaining space in the center, supporting the bishop at d5. Rook to e8, Carlsen places his rook opposite the queen, and the queen moves out of the way. Bishop to f8. Now, what this does is this unveils the rook on e4. So what Carlsen is threatening now is to play b5, b4, kicking this knight at c3 away, and then just taking the pawn on e4. So Pragg defends that pawn with queen to f4. But now b4, knight to a4. And here, Magnus sees a way to get rid of a very powerful piece of white's. This bishop on d5 radiates a lot of power. So even though his queen is under threat from the knight at a4, he goes ahead and takes the bishop anyway, because now his knight is threatening Prague's queen. So if knight takes queen, the knight would take queen. So rook has to take the knight. Now queen moves to e6, still attacking the e4 pawn. Pragg plays rook a to d1. Perhaps a better idea, computers show us, would have been knight takes c5. After a few exchanges, you have a fairly equal position. Carlsen would have this past b4 pawn, though, in an equal material ending. It would be a complex position, but essentially equal. Pragg plays rook a to d1. Now rook to a8. Magnus could have gone ahead and played c4 here, it appears, which is the idea he wants to play. We talked about advancing this pawn majority, because if pawn takes, rook to a8, and the knight is really low on squares, doesn't really have anywhere to go, and Magnus is threatening bishop to b7, hitting the rook, aiming at the e-pawn. If rook to a1 to defend the knight, then bishop to b7, rook d to d1, bishop to e4, and he would be winning here. The threat of bishop c2, queen to c6, and the knight on a4 is in big, big trouble. Instead, Magnus plays rook to a8, which still does threaten this c4 move. So because this c4 idea is so dangerous, endangering the knight, Pragg really has to do something about it, and he plays the queen back to c1 to control the c4 square. Unfortunately, that means he has to give up the pawn on e4. So queen takes e4. White plays h3 to give his king luft, so he doesn't have to worry about any back rank mating threats. Rook to a7 to prevent white from taking two minor pieces for a rook. Rook takes d7. Now queen to d2. This is a nasty threat from Pragg. He's threatening to play rook to e1, and that would actually win the game on the spot, because he would then be able to, the queen would take the rook, because if the queen moves, you just get the rook at e8. So to avoid this threat, Magnus plays queen to g6, knight to h4 to hit the queen to e6, and now knight to f5. So Pragg's attack is really, really strong. And most players, I think even strong grandmasters, might not be able to defend this position. But Magnus is at another level. And his next move is really the move of a world champion. But let's look at Pragg's threat. He's threatening to take on g7. Let's say he plays knight to g7, if it were his move here. Bishop takes, the exchange, and then rook to d6. And the queen and the rook aim at this h6 pawn. After queen to e7, queen f6. Then rook 1 to d3, allowing a rook lift to g3, knight f8, and then he would just, if knight to g6 to block, which you would have to play, you just take twice on g6, and he would be winning. But it's important that in order for this variation to work, white has to be able to play the rook to d3. That is what makes Magnus's next move so brilliant, that he saw all of that, and he realizes that all he has to do is play c4. And now none of that works. Because this pawn controls the d3 square, that variation doesn't work anymore. Now, if he takes with the knight, Magnus just plays c3, counterattacking white's queen and blocking the bishop on the diagonal, and he would be winning. But what if Pragg just decides to change the order and take with the bishop first, so the c pawn can't block it? Well, bishop g7, knight g7, king g7, rook to d6. Looks like the same variation. Queen e7, queen h6 check, king g8. But now this rook cannot play to d3, and that makes all the difference in the world. There's no way for that rook to get in. If he moves it to d5, then knight to e5 blocks the rook's access to the g file. So if the other rook goes to d4 to check, then just knight f8. And, oh, we don't have to do that. But, and if the other rook moves, just knight to g6. And that's it. So he saw all of this when he played this c4 move. Absolutely amazing. So Pragg goes ahead and plays the queen to d4, still aiming at g7. Knight to f6 blocks that diagonal and counterattacks the rook at d5. Knight b6, now c3. So finally, it's been the strategy all along for Carlsen to advance his queenside majority. And now we see the fruit of all that work. He had to calculate on his way there, but the basic strategy was actually quite simple. Knight takes bishop, queen takes d5, queen takes knight takes a7, and here's the final maneuver to win the game. Carlsen takes the bishop on b2. The pawn is now 1 square away from queening. He's threatening to play the knight here and then advance the pawn. So rook to b1 keeps the pawn from advancing. Rook to e2 defends the pawn laterally, and now the idea of knight c3, knight b1 is unstoppable, and Magnus has a completely winning position, and Pragg resigned the game. An amazing game. That move c4, I mean, there aren't many players in the history of the game that could see deep enough into a position to play a move like that, knowing it defended everything. Absolutely amazing. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.